So, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to the Scientific Committee, our client CA11, Stefan Sudak, and thank you to all of our distinguished guests for joining us as we explore key performance indicators to measure sponsorship performance. Before we begin, I'd just like to give a brief overview of our project by first introducing our lovely team. So we have over here Juan, Kirian, Ashish, and myself, Stephanie Krishak. However, most importantly, I'd like to introduce you to CA11. CA11 was founded in 2012 and is based in Lyon, Switzerland. CA11 is the exclusive agent selling, managing, and servicing all the commercial rights for UEFA's national team competitions. These competitions, the rights are only the sponsorship, licensing, and broadcasting. However, recently this summer, they produced the UEFA 2016 sporting event, and we wanted to just give you a brief overview of the sponsorship activations that they had hosted this summer. So I hope that gave you a little taste of what year 2016 was and what the sponsors of this event had done. And moving on to our objective, so with the changing economic circumstances and the increasing emergence of alternative promotion platforms, the market is overloaded and cluttered. In fact, 5,000 advertisements are seen per day per person. During our initial meeting with CA11, it became evident that sponsors were looking and becoming more stringent on their investment decisions. CFOs, not the marketing department, were looking and becoming predominant decision makers and requiring more concrete evidence in their return on investment decisions. So this begs the question, how can partners unlock the potential of their sponsorship, and what key performance indicators, or KPIs as we shall call them, can help sponsors get the most out of their sponsorship? Now I'll pass the floor to Ashish, who will give you a quick walkthrough of how we accomplish this mission and our project methodology.
Thanks, Stephanie. So what Stephanie spoke just now was the cake that we set out to bake for CA11. What I'm going to speak about is the recipe and the method that we followed while baking it. And at the last part of the presentation, we will talk about the look, feel, and probably also try to taste the cake a little bit. So before diving into the methodology, when we met CA11 for the first couple of times before starting the project, what we, the feel that we got was basically that sponsorship as a promotional tool has some inherent benefits. However, those benefits are not coming out as concretely as they should in comparison with other promotional tools. And that was the essential objective of this project, to try and compare sponsorship with other promotional tools and to bring out the benefits that sponsorship has as against these tools. So the project was broadly divided into three categories. In the first one, we looked at the promotional tools available in the market, which consisted of sponsorship, direct marketing, philanthropy, and a lot more that you'll see later. We tried to compare them and see where sponsorship stands in comparison with the other tools. In the second step, we looked at sports properties, the Champions League, the World Cup, and the Olympics, and so on, and looked at what kind of sponsors come up for these properties and what our standard sponsorship packages offer to them. And the last part, we looked at how one could measure sponsorship investments. What are the key performance indicators that could be put in place to measure sponsorship investments effectively? Because that was the essential problem that we were tackling. Now, moving on to the first of the steps. As I said, we put sponsorship in the focus and looked at other promotional tools around sponsorship. We tried to draw out SWOT analysis for each of these tools: direct marketing, guerrilla marketing, product placement, and the likes, and ended with sponsorship, a detailed SWOT for sponsorship, and tried to look at what are the advantages of going for a sponsorship activation as against the demerits of doing that, and what are the main motivations that a sponsor comes in and puts his money for a sponsorship activation. That's what we looked at in this stage. This was purely academic research done by the four of us along with Stefan in our meetings from time to time. Moving on to phase two, we looked at different kind of events, different kind of sports properties that are in the different scales, in the different kind of operations and stuff like that, and try to look at what kind of sponsors make a queue to put their money into these properties. What are the motivations that a sponsor has to invest in such a property, and what do they get out of it? What are the activations that they end up doing? So to give you an example of the motivations, when we looked at the Champions League, we looked at sponsors such as Gazprom, who come in from a purely B2B perspective, and whose aim is to create reputation for the brand more than anything else. And then for somebody like Nissan, who are coming in from a different part of the world into Europe and putting in money to gain brand recognition in Europe. Obviously, their motivation also is to increase sales, but to create presence in Europe is a motivation that comes before increasing sales. And also with some other brands like Pepsi, who are absolutely ubiquitous, probably present in this room as well, but whose quest is to try and increase brand awareness, the marginal brand awareness that they can, and also to engage with fans in such events. So these are the different sponsors and the different motivations that we noted down in this particular stage. So by the end of this stage, we had a list of motivations which probably went beyond the number of pages that we had in the project diary. And we then moved to the last phase, where we kind of took those motivations and drew out KPIs from the motivations. So the motivation as such might be measurable, it might not be measurable, but the KPI is definitely measurable, and that was the idea of coming out with a KPI. So by the end of this phase, we again had about 50 key performance indicators, and from those 50, we wanted to then narrow it down to the best possible KPIs that a sponsor should look at once the event is over, to kind of measure the investment and look at a report card and probably understand whether the investment has been successful or not. So based on these three criteria that you could see on the slides, we narrowed that list down to 11 KPIs, and that essentially constitutes the toolbox, which is the cake, as I said. So to present the toolbox, I will invite Kirian.
Thanks, Ashish. So after analyzing all the KPIs and conceptualizing the toolbox, which is a compilation of the 11 best, or at least the 11 more tangible, let's say, to measure these KPIs, this was actually the final outcome of our team project. But then we decided to go a bit further and build graphically how these KPIs could be presented, organized, and then presented. This way, CA11 can present to their sponsors, if they want, not only the concept or the idea behind these KPIs, but also show in a visual identity like what they can measure and what they are all about. So here, I'll deliver you a guide with all the graphics, and that's how it ended up, or you already have it. Thank you very much. And you have up there the 11 KPIs, but today we're going to present you only 5 because time is limited, and so we tried to select the 5 KPIs that can give you a good overview and also tackle some of the motivations that we have identified through our research. And please bear in mind that we used the example of the UEFA Euro 2016 to build the report, but the data and figures there are merely illustrated. They are not real, they just serve for the purpose of giving you the example. So to start presenting the KPIs, we're going to start with the KPIs that can be measured through the digital platforms. So we're going to start with the social media metrics, or also called owned media metrics. So they're called owned media metrics because we're just talking about the social media pages that belongs to the sponsors. So when it comes to social media analytics, there's so much data you can extract from it that sometimes people get a bit lost in what's really meaningful to measure the goals. So here, the key aspect was really identifying which metrics could measure directly the impact of the sponsorship on the sponsors' awareness and social media pages. So if you look, the first metric we chose was the engagement level. So we measured the engagement level, the increase of the engagement level across 4 different platforms and classified in 3 different categories, so likes, comments, and shares. And here you can see very directly how the sponsorship impacted not only the increase of the brand awareness, but this also tackles another motivation that is very present in some sponsors, which is the customer's engagement. So they want to make sure the customers are engaging with the brand. Still talking about engagement, here we build a timeline where you have 4 different periods: pre-activation period, activation period, event, and post-event, and they can see exactly when the engagement level went up or down. Another example that you can use is crossing the information between the territories where the sponsors page had an increase of traffic or engagement, and the territories where the UEFA Euro 2016 page has a lot of popularity. So that can be also a good indicator. So let's move on to the second KPI, which is earned media metrics. Now we're going to talk about the pages that don't belong to the sponsors. So this is pretty much what are others talking about your brand. So the first metric to use is the number of mentions. So we measure the number of mentions across the months. So here counting for before the event, during the event, and after the event. And most importantly, we measure the categories of these mentions. So for instance, if these mentions were in the social media, we're talking about fans or customers. If they were articles on news websites, then it's media exposure. So they have different weight and different measures. And the first thing we have measured is what we call sentiment and tone. What does that mean? That means we can measure if in these mentions were built in a positive or in a negative context. And let's be honest, this metric is actually even more important than the number of mentions. So now I pass the floor on to João, who's going to explain you the following KPIs.
So we just had a look at the digital KPIs. Now we'll have a deeper look at what we call traditional KPIs. The first one is classic for the classic, which is called top of mind. Let me explain you what is top of mind, even though most of you guys know what it is. It's the first brand that comes to your mind when you associate that to event property or an event. So let me ask you, which brand do you remember from the Euro? Do you have any answer for that? Yes?
Gatorade.
Gatorade, right? Do you have any others?
Probably the best beer.
I know it was
Probably the best beer. Yeah, it was a great activation campaign.
Powerade. Powerade, sorry.
Powerade, alright. Alright, so you see there, the question is, you ask that kind of question to get at what is the first brand that comes to your mind. You say Carlsberg, even better, probably the best in the world. I think they could.
I didn't say Carlsberg. I didn't see Carlsberg.
Well, I did. Maybe some of you guys say they're also Heineken for the Champions League. Alright, but that's fair. The question is, what do you do with that data? Actually, it's extremely powerful because it does influence any potential consumer in the purchasing decision. So I still remember sneakers from the World Cup 1994. I know my colleagues are a bit younger, so maybe they don't remember that. And I remember going to the supermarket and I was like telling my parents, oh, we should buy sneakers. Why? Yeah, I saw it on TV, whatever, you know. And so it has a great influence, and it's something you can use as a brand to sell, to increase your sales. Well, now there is another one which is as important and just different. We don't really look at that, but employee satisfaction rates is absolutely essential. Your employees are the ambassadors of your brand. If they are not convinced that the event that you're sponsoring is not like linked to the values of the company, well, then you have a problem. The employees share, they're talking to each other, they're talking to the outside world. We're living in a digital world. They are sharing information on LinkedIn, on Facebook. It's extremely important that brands understand. For example, Coca-Cola going to Olympic Games, they have all the employees and they make, for example, a video about how involving employees during the video, and maybe they participated, they contributed to that great success. And making employees proud of you, your company, make them as well increase your reputation and also increase your corporate social responsibility, which is right now a hot topic. Well, that leads us to the last KPI that we're gonna talk about right now, which maybe is less obvious, but it's also extremely powerful. The value of database. What does that mean? In a nutshell, it means how much value do you get to be associated to the event. So let me give you an example. During the Euro, there were thousands of people that purchased tickets online and they gave the data, they gave information. The emails, the contact details, phone numbers, the address, all that kind of information. Those information can be sold to the sponsors. That creates value. Because what they do in sponsor with that information is that afterwards they're gonna, for example, do a marketing campaign. And they're gonna launch a marketing campaign and target the right consumer they want to target. So if you want to reach, for example, people in Peru from a certain segments in the population, well, you will have that if you associate your brand with the proper events. The Euro is very potential because it has a lot of consumers. Of course, there are other events that are much more, I would say, niche oriented. So that, I guess, leads us to a conclusion. And in order to wrap up a little bit what we saw today, well, first of all, it's important to say that the toolbox that we provide you there is scalable and measurable in the way that a sponsor will use it in order to compare its KPI to the previous events. Let me give you a concrete example. You sponsor the Champions League, Heineken, for example, you will compare the data in 2015 from 2016. You will not compare it to another event because every event property has its different values and has different strengths and weaknesses. It's just no way to compare that. Also, it's a great, I think, decision enabler for sponsor to check whether they're on the right track or not. They're going to measure, for example, brand awareness. If the main purpose of a new brand coming to a new market is to raise that brand awareness, they need to check whether they reach the objective or not. If they didn't, then they have to rethink the decision process. It's extremely important as well. Finally, I think it's all about, at the end of the day, about value. How much value do you bring to a sponsor? How much value do you get for an event? How much value do you get when you associate your brand to specific events? And also, what do you do with all those data? So this all leads us to, well, open the debate to you guys, because we have printed a couple of KPI there, but they're all of the one, and I guess I'm sure you have a lot of questions about that. So I would like to thank you for your attention. We would like to thank you for your attention, and let's open the question to the floor. Thank you.